Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, I rise today to support my colleague, Senator Kaine, in support of this resolution before us, a resolution that would prohibit the United States from conducting offensive military strikes against Iran, unless or until such time as Congress may authorize it. This is how security policy in our constitutional republic is supposed to work. It's how decisions like these are supposed to be made. Congress authorizes the use of military force, and the President, as Commander-in-Chief, directs the military as it undertakes the effort to complete its missions. This arrangement gives the American people the best of both worlds: a deliberative, representative legislature to declare war and a single, decisive Commander-in-Chief to lead the troops. Unfortunately, Congress has not upheld its end of the responsibility. Our system of checks and balances, while very beneficial to the American people, and while giving us the greatest opportunity to protect our freedom, our liberty, and our system of government, imposes a degree of rigor and accountability on Congress, which its members, unfortunately, sometimes are inclined to shirk whenever possible. This trend has sadly gained momentum for decades, and it's done so under presidents, houses of representatives, and senates of every conceivable partisan combination. And now, nearly 2 decades into multiple wars without clear missions or paths to victory, it's time for Congress to reassert, on behalf of our constituents, our vital constitutional role in American war-making. Before addressing the merits of this particular resolution, let me first dispel 2 very mistaken assumptions being made about it. First, it is not about defying President Trump. Quite to the contrary, this resolution supports President Trump and his particularly deferential approach, one that defers to the American people, one that accepts at the outset the fact that we can't fight wars all around the globe in perpetuity, and that we certainly can't and shouldn't do that without the consent of the American people and that of their elected representatives in Congress. Indeed, on this issue, President Trump is the most restrained and the most Constitution-minded Commander-in-Chief we've had in decades. In fact, I believe he is the most restrained and Constitution-minded Commander-in-Chief we've had in my entire lifetime. He's exactly the kind of partner Congress needs in order to get the Constitution's war-making process back on the rails, back on the same rails that were designed in 1787. Second, this resolution is not about condemning the strike against General Soleimani last month. After all, the strike against Soleimani worked. He was an enemy of the United States, with the blood of hundreds of Americans and thousands of Iraqis, Syrians, and even other Iranians on his hands. Everything we know about him and his work of terror confirms that he was planning to kill again, and to do so soon. Rather, what this resolution is about is Congress reclaiming its rightful powers to restore accountability and consensus to this most grave of all public policy decisions that we as members of Congress are asked to make. Now, I understand why members of Congress are okay with pretending to be pundits on matters of national security, cheering the troops when things go well, and attacking the president when they don't. But we're not just political pundits on cable news shows. We have a job to do based on an oath that we took right here in this chamber to uphold and protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. And in order to enable the President of the United States to do his job correctly, we have to be willing to do ours. You see, this is part of the evil design of the military-industrial complex, is to convince members of Congress, first and foremost, that they don't have to and shouldn't want to put their name on the line when it comes to war power. This unfairly puts the blame and the accountability all on the President of the United States. That's wrong. Just as importantly, Mr. President, it disconnects the American people from their elected representatives here in the Senate and in the House of Representatives, from a process that really could put not just American treasure, but also American blood, the blood of their own sons and daughters, on the line. That's not right. Founders could not have been any clearer about this. That's especially true when it comes to the greatest founder of them all. Remember that when the Miami and Wabash Indians attacked Americans north of the Ohio River between 1791 and 1794, President George Washington carefully confined his military operations to exclusively defensive measures. The Constitution, Washington wrote, vests the power of declaring war with Congress. Therefore, no offensive expedition of importance can be undertaken until after they have deliberated upon this subject and authorized such a measure. Close quote. Our first president, George Washington, was a humble man, and he was a modest man. One of my favorite paintings in this entire building can be found in the Capitol Rotunda, where you see George Washington handing his commission back to the Continental Congress. This at the moment when he had ascended to the apex of power. This at the moment when he was the most respected, well-known person, certainly in the Western Hemisphere, possibly in the entire world. This at a moment when in any other land, at any point in world history, George Washington was in a position to become a monarch, a king. He chose not to be. He said right then and right there, not on this soil, not on my watch. I'm handing my commission back to the Republican institution that employed me to begin with. So yes, he was a humble man, and he was a modest man. But this wasn't just an act of humility or modesty. It was duty. He understood that he had taken an oath to uphold, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. And as president, he would not deviate from it, because he had taken an oath that he wouldn't. Under the Constitution, whose drafting President Washington oversaw before he was president of the United States, while he was president of the Constitutional Convention, and to which he swore an oath of office later, that the power to direct war would reside in him as President of the United States, as Commander-in-Chief. But the power to declare war resided exclusively with Congress. This was, of course, very different than the form of government that we had left just a few years prior to that. Under our previous system of government, the one based in London, the Parliament had no role in declaring war. Declaring war was up to the executive, the monarch, the king. The king could, and in many instances would and did, take the country to war. It was the job of the legislative branch of government, of the Parliament, to figure out what to do about it, how to fund it, and where to go from there. But it was up to the king and the king alone to take us to war. This, Alexander Hamilton explained in Federalist 69, was exactly the kind of system we didn't want. It would be up to Congress in the first instance to declare war. Congress and Congress alone would have this power. Why? Well, because it's the branch of government most accountable to the people at the most regular intervals. When the American people are called upon to put their own blood and treasure, their own sons and daughters on the line in the name of safety, security, freedom, nothing else can suffice but a vote in Congress. George Washington understood that. Donald Trump understands that today. And to his great credit, President Trump has followed this standard and has countered recent Iranian aggression primarily through economic sanctions. They're working, and it appears that Iran is standing down. Tehran has already had to cut back support for international terrorist organizations and its nuclear program, and its oil exports are plummeting. Iran's economy has been crippled, contracting by almost 10%. And the Iranian people know it is the fault of their own government officials. Tens of thousands of Iranian protesters have taken to the streets to protest their own government, even knowing that such action may lead them to injury or imprisonment or even death. Even the New York Times has admitted that the Iranian regime is losing the will to confront the United States. There may be a pathway to peace and prosperity for the Iranian people through sanctions, relief, and trade if the Iranian government is willing to cease its support for radical Islamic militant organizations and abandon its pursuit of nuclear weapons in ICBMs. Until then, the United States, under President Trump's leadership, will maintain maximum pressure through sanctions and defend the U.S. from any further attacks. I stand firmly behind President Trump in this course of action. And like President Trump, I believe that we ought to avoid war if we can. After nearly 2 decades of military entanglement in Iraq and Afghanistan, much of which was fostered by Department of Defense bureaucrats, deceiving Congress and misleading the American people, as we've recently tragically learned, the last thing we need is another aimless, protracted conflict in the Middle East. And the other last thing we need is to have such a conflict occur without Congress even authorizing it. In any event, war with Iran is currently neither warranted nor consistent with our strategic interests. To be very clear, under this resolution, the President would retain all of his authority as Commander-in-Chief to take defensive measures against active threats to U.S. persons, assets, and the homeland, including our armed forces abroad and our diplomats and U.S. embassies, even without a declaration of war or an authorization for the use of military force. Such power inheres and resides in Article 2. He already has that power. Nothing in this resolution can or would or even attempts to undermine or erode that power. However, even when defensive measures are conducted, the administration should share the justifying evidence with Congress. This, you see, is how this inherent tension between, on the one hand, the Congressional war declaration power in Article 1, and on the other hand, the Article 2 power that the President has as Commander-in-Chief. This is how they're held in balance, is for that information sharing process to be ongoing. As a separate branch of government, the branch with the constitutional prerogative over the power to declare war, we're not required to simply accept an administration's talking points as a matter of faith, especially after almost 2 decades of deception in Afghanistan. Intelligence sharing ensures that Congress can appropriately determine whether it should or should not provide the administration with further authority to conduct offensive military force. The intelligence so far shared with Congress on recent actions taken against Iran has fallen short. But my main concern with the briefing that I called the worst that I'd ever witnessed on military matters in my more than 9 years in the United States Senate was that we were given no indication whatsoever that any ongoing offensive action against Iran would occur with consultation and authorization from Congress. This was inexcusable. This was, moreover, not the President's approach. It was not something that would have occurred in the President's presence. It's certainly not something that would have been communicated by the President himself, because this is not how Donald Trump operates. That briefing was not the President's fault. That briefing was the fault of individuals who decided to go off on a detour of their own, forgetting who they represent. Worst of all, in that briefing it was suggested that engaging in public debate, discussion, and deliberation about further military action in Iran, in other words, precisely what we're doing right here and right now, would somehow empower our enemies and undermine the morale of our men and women overseas. Mr. President, this is as false as it is insulting to the American people and demeaning to the constitutional framework to which each of us has sworn an oath. It's contrary to our very form of government. constitutionally separated powers, exercised with accountability to the people via checks and balances, are precisely what makes the United States strong. Bowing to the politicians' impulse to avoid responsibility and subvert our constitutional duty, that is what empowers our enemies and undermines the morale of our nation. Whether the United States sends our young men and women into harm's way, yet again, is on us. Not to cheer or jeer, but rather to decide and stand accountable for. And so, of course, that decision ought to be made at the end of a very public debate that requires not only our attention, but our contributions, and ultimately our assent. Our names have to be on the line if we're going to offer up our fellow beings to stand in harm's way. For too long, Congress has deliberately and in a very cowardly manner shrunk from its constitutional responsibility for its own narrow, selfish, shallow political interests. But by taking itself out of the process of debating and declaring war, Congress has taken the American people out of the process. And that, Mr. President, is simply unacceptable. It's time to turn the page. Osama bin Laden is dead. So are the 9/11 terrorists. General Soleimani is dead. Iran is weakened and isolated. Saddam Hussein is dead and has been out of power for a generation. And Iraq is a sovereign nation that can and should dictate its own course. We now face new challenges, and our priorities have rightfully changed, and they must. While this resolution speaks only to offensive action against Iran, I believe it's time to repeal the 2002 AUMF and bring our troops in Iraq home. It's also time to repeal the 2001 AUMF and bring our troops in Afghanistan home. That is a question that we can and should address in this body. But in the meantime, we as a body and as a nation should at least agree that there is no justification for further military action in Iran in the absence of a new authorization for the use of military force or a declaration of war by Congress. This resolution is consistent with the President's desire to keep us out of excessive, unnecessary, and especially undeclared unconstitutional wars. It's consistent with the vision of our founding fathers, who sought to make it harder to enter into war by requiring express consent from a bicameral legislature. And it is consistent with the conviction that the American people, whose sons and daughters lay down their lives to defend us, should get a say in this matter. President Trump wants to make America great again. I stand with him. The military-industrial complex wants to make America Great Britain again, and I stand strongly against the military-industrial complex. Making America Great Britain again would include such things as giving the executive the power and keeping the legislative branch out of the power of declaring war. That's wrong. That's not what our Constitution allows. It's not even what President Trump wants. We need to support this resolution.